He says, human beings are all born with distinct and different natures known in Sanskrit language as vasanas. Vasanas are one's inherent tendencies, inclinations, which manifest from early childhood. Together they constitute the features which define a person's individual character. The vasanas of an individual project as his characteristic temperament. Thus, legal vasanas manifest as a lawyer, engineering vasanas engineer, medical vasanas as a doctor, etc. Parents and guardians ought to know this stark reality and not interfere with the flow of vasanas beyond a point of necessity. Their irrational interference would break the backbone of a youngster. Okay, so this is sort of harking back to what we were saying in the previous lectures. That, of course, as parents we have an obligation to, quote-unquote, interfere with the children in the sense that they have to be effectively directed. But again, he uses this phrase, beyond a point of necessity. The problem, and he gets into this in the next paragraph, but the problem is that not understanding this concept of vasanas, what parents have a tendency to do is to decide what's good for the child, not based upon the child's temperament, but based upon their own perspective. You should do this. You should do that. You should follow this line of study. You should adopt this course in life. The problem, of course, with that is what we've already discovered. So he says the obligation of a parent is to understand the concept of swadharma, which we're going to get into, one's own vasanas, and then identify that in the youngsters. So you'll see this happening in different ways. One of the ways that you see this happening is that we presume other people have the same tendencies as us. We presume that other people will think that something is good because we think it is good. That this is the only logical way to think about a situation. This is the only thing that is appropriate. So we've got our own mental pattern. What we fail to recognize is that each person has their own distinct vasanas. Thoughts, feelings, desires, intentions, and actions. Now, when we sit down and think about it, it's obvious to us. Of course, everyone thinks something different. The problem is that knowledge, that recognition that everyone has their own way of thinking about things, their own value systems, their own ideas of what's good and bad, etc., that knowledge disappears when we function without intellectual governance. It's the mind which has its own perspective. And if we lack that sort of intellectual oversight, everything that we do is adopted from that perspective, including what we presume other people to think, feel, and their behaviour. So this is especially true when it comes to the parents. So you'll see this when there are expectations of a youngster's behaviour, or attitudes, or values, and there's a sort of confusion. How can you possibly, what's wrong with you? That sort of question. What is wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with the child. Everything is wrong with the parent because they haven't gone through the process of analysing, well, what is my child's nature? What does he value? What are his thoughts? What are his feelings? What are his own inclinations? So the reason that we don't make this analysis is because we lack that understanding that each person has their own distinct tendencies. If we were to be able to recognise that each person has their own distinct tendencies, then it would be natural for us to say, well, what are your tendencies? We wouldn't presume to think that what I think is common sense, everybody will think is common sense. Everybody would do this because it's common sense, right? No, not everybody thinks that's common sense. Each person has their own distinct tendencies. So he gives an example here now to illustrate how this manifests, this lack of ability to understand. He says, a true episode that occurred in Chennai, India, drives home this point. An eminent surgeon commanded a large medical practice in the city. His family comprised himself, his wife, and his son. Both the parents doted on their son. In his extreme attachment, the surgeon wanted his son also to become a surgeon. To fulfill his desire, he built a private 5-story building to house his surgery. The boy grew up, finished his high school, and opted to study automobile engineering. The father flew into a rage and screamed, "For whom do you think I built this surgery?" and actually forced the poor boy into joining the medical school. Succumbing to the pressure, the boy struggled to complete his course and became a surgeon in his father's hospital. Thereafter, the father expired, bequeathing the hospital to his son. But the tragic scene in that set up in the plight of the young man surgeon. He is seen most of the time engaged in his garage fixing the problems with the hospital vehicles while his colleagues operated on the patients. So what he's saying here is that there is a tendency to see other people the same way that we see ourselves, especially when it comes to the attachment relationship. So often, you're probably familiar with this idea of the desire for children is, in part, a desire to see one's self replicated. And so when you do that, what is replicated is, obviously, it's yourself. So this person will have the same values, the same beliefs, and the same tendencies. I'm a surgeon, my son will be a surgeon. And so when that's the case, there will be a tendency to push people into that frame of mind. What we're seeing here is a very gross, but it's actually a true example. So what he did was push the son into the same field of study, into the same field of career. Now, as he talks about at the end, what happened in the end? Once the father expired, then the freedom came. Now I can do what I want. So instead of following the surgeon aspect of his career, he followed instead his vasanas. Now, it's a relatively simple story, but you can imagine the frustration and the tension and the conflict, not just between the two, the father and the son, but within the boy himself. He succumbed to the pressure. And thereafter, he would have spent, 4 or 5 years studying, and then a number of years working in something that does not fit his temperament, that does not fit his character. So he's miserable. He's waiting for the father to die. Relief. Now I can do what I like. This is not a pleasant thing to think about when you're a parent. My children just waiting for me to die so they can be happy. And so this is why he says it's incumbent upon parents to understand this. When we have that insight that every individual functions according to their own nature, we lose the expectation that others will function in any other way. We know that that's how they function, so they will. That allows us to give others the freedom to function as they wish. And as we've discussed at other times, it doesn't mean that as a parent you cease to guide the person, but beyond a point of necessity. So just a word on this idea of understanding. It's the difference between intellectually appreciating something, yes, that makes sense, and having it filtered down so that it becomes a natural perspective that we adopt. Most people you speak to will agree with these sorts of ideas. Yes, everyone has their own perspective, everyone has their own tendencies, and they should be allowed to follow it. The reason that we don't allow spouses, children, friends, colleagues, etc., to have their own opinion and to follow their own path is because we don't have it as wisdom. It's knowledge, but it's not wisdom. And you'll find in any field, people who are they're well versed in a particular body of knowledge, they know it very well, but that doesn't mean they're able to practice it. It hasn't become second nature. And so the study of these ideas is not just reflection to gain an intellectual appreciation. We have to understand what we're trying to do when we study this knowledge. What we're trying to do when we study this knowledge is restructure our thinking patterns so that they're natural. Not that we're forcing it. To an extent we have to practice, but we're trying to change things so that it becomes a natural state now. So we're growing into that. That demands a certain degree of surrender. So this idea of surrender is, what it means is that we are willing to have our mind changed. right? Often you'll see people who are, let's stay with this particular study, you'll see people who are studying this knowledge to acquire information. Right? And it just becomes that, it becomes a body of knowledge that they have at their fingertips, like stored on a hard drive, that they can then drag back up. If we study this in the absence of surrender, there will be zero personality development. So when we talk about reflection, when we talk about questioning, implicit in that is the notion of surrender. What we can also call humility. It's dropping that notion of I know.